What happens when a military operation becomes so catastrophic, so utterly devastating in its failure, that enemies who moments before were trying to kill each other agree to bury the truth together? What kind of disaster could possibly unite sworn adversaries in a conspiracy of silence that would last for decades? The answer lies in one of the most bizarre and tragic episodes of the Second World War, a mission so flawed in its conception and so horrific in its execution that both the Allied and Axis powers chose to erase it from the official record rather than admit what had transpired. This is not a story of heroism, though brave men died. It is not a tale of strategic brilliance, though careful planning went into its design. Instead, this is the account of Operation Confluence, a mission that never officially existed, that left no trace in the war's formal chronicles, and that killed more men through incompetence than enemy action. It is a story about the fog of war at its most impenetrable, about the deadly consequences of pride and bureaucracy, and about the strange honor that sometimes exists even between mortal enemies. The mission involved Allied forces, German defenders, and a series of catastrophic miscommunications and miscalculations that turned what should have been a routine operation into a nightmare of friendly fire, mistaken identity, and unnecessary death. When the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, commanders on both sides faced a terrible choice: acknowledge the disaster and accept the consequences, or agree to mutual silence and spare themselves the scandal. They chose silence, and for more than 30 years, the families of the dead were told convenient lies about how their sons and husbands had perished. The date was October 17, 1944. The place was the French-German border region, specifically a stretch of the Vosges Mountains that had become a brutal stalemate in the Allied advance toward the Rhine. The war in Europe had reached a critical phase. The D-Day landings had succeeded beyond expectation. Paris had been liberated in August, and Allied forces were pushing toward Germany's western frontier. But the easy victories of the summer had given way to the grinding, bloody warfare of autumn. The Vosges Mountains presented a formidable natural barrier, a densely forested region of steep ridges and narrow valleys that favored the defender. German forces had established a series of fortified positions throughout the mountains, creating what military planners called a defense in depth. Every ridgeline became a battlefield, every valley a potential killing ground. American and French forces were paying in blood for every mile of advance, and the High Command was desperate for some way to break the stalemate. It was in this context that Operation Confluence was conceived. The plan called for a combined American and Free French force to conduct a deep penetration raid behind German lines, targeting a critical supply depot and communication center in the town of St. Wendel, approximately 35 miles behind the front lines. The operation would involve three separate elements: a parachute drop by the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment, a ground advance by elements of the French 2nd Armored Division, and a diversionary attack by the 45th Infantry Division to draw German attention away from the main thrust. On paper, the plan seemed sound. In practice, it was doomed from the start by a toxic combination of inter-service rivalry, poor intelligence, inadequate communication equipment, and commanders more concerned with glory than with the lives of their men. The officer who conceived the operation was Colonel Harrison Blackwood, a West Point graduate who had spent most of the war in staff positions and desperately wanted combat command before the war ended. Blackwood was intelligent, ambitious, and utterly lacking in battlefield experience. He saw Operation Confluence as his ticket to promotion and recognition. The forces assigned to the mission were among the best available. The 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment had distinguished itself in Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. The French 2nd Armored Division, commanded by the legendary General Philippe Leclerc, had liberated Paris. The men were experienced, well-trained, and confident. They deserved better than what was about to happen to them. Understanding the broader strategic situation helps explain why such a flawed operation was approved in the first place. By October 1944, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was under tremendous pressure to maintain momentum. The failure of Operation Market Garden in September had demonstrated that the war would not be over by Christmas, as some had hoped. Winter was approaching, and with it the prospect of months of static warfare that would give the Germans time to regroup and fortify their positions. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, was being urged by both Washington and London to deliver results. American public opinion, which had been solidly behind the war effort, was showing signs of war weariness. The presidential election was approaching, and Franklin Roosevelt needed continued support for his war policies. British resources were stretched to the breaking point after 5 years of war. The Soviet Union was advancing in the east, and Stalin was making demands about the post-war division of Europe. In this environment, Allied commanders felt pressure to take risks and show progress. Colonel Blackwood understood this context and exploited it. When presenting Operation Confluence to his superiors, he emphasized that a successful raid would disrupt German logistics, demonstrate Allied capability for deep operations, boost morale among American and French forces, and potentially create opportunities for a breakthrough in the Vosges. He downplayed the risks and complexities. His briefings featured optimistic intelligence assessments and best-case scenario planning. Officers who raised concerns were characterized as overly cautious or lacking offensive spirit. The approval process for Operation Confluence revealed structural problems in the Allied command system. The operation required coordination between American and French forces, between ground and air units, and between multiple headquarters with overlapping jurisdictions. Each level of command reviewed the plan primarily from its own organizational perspective. No single authority conducted a comprehensive assessment of whether all the pieces would actually work together. The assumption was that professional military officers at each level would identify problems in their areas of responsibility, but this distributed responsibility meant that systemic problems fell through the cracks. The seeds of disaster were planted weeks before the actual operation, in the planning rooms and headquarters far behind the front lines. Colonel Blackwood's initial proposal had been ambitious but achievable, calling for a single-night raid with clear objectives and pre-planned withdrawal routes. However, as the plan moved up the chain of command, each senior officer added his own requirements and modifications, transforming a focused operation into an unwieldy monster. The first complication came from the intelligence section. Aerial reconnaissance suggested that the German supply depot at Sankt Wendel contained substantial quantities of fuel and ammunition. If destroyed, it could significantly hamper German operations in the region. However, the same reconnaissance also indicated heavy anti-aircraft defenses around the town, making a parachute drop extremely hazardous. The intelligence officers recommended either changing the drop zone or cancelling the airborne component altogether. Blackwood refused. He had promised paratroopers in his operation, and paratroopers he would have. Instead of changing the plan, he simply moved the drop zone 3 miles west of the town into what maps indicated was an open area suitable for parachute operations. What the maps did not show, because the aerial photographs had been taken in summer, was that the open area was actually a partially logged forest section with hundreds of tree stumps between 3 and 6 feet high, invisible beneath the tall grass. Paratroopers landing in such terrain would face serious injury, even in a training exercise. The intelligence failure regarding the drop zone reflected broader problems with how information was gathered and evaluated. Aerial reconnaissance had limitations that were not always acknowledged. Photographs taken from high altitude could miss crucial ground-level details. Seasonal changes could make terrain appear different from how it would actually be encountered. Photo interpreters, working under pressure to process large volumes of imagery, sometimes made assumptions based on incomplete information. Moreover, there was cultural resistance to acknowledging intelligence uncertainties. Commanders wanted definitive assessments, not qualified judgments hedged with caveats. Intelligence officers learned to present their findings with more confidence than the evidence warranted. In the case of Operation Confluence, the intelligence section reported that the drop zone was suitable for airborne operations, when a more accurate assessment would have been, appears suitable based on limited information, recommend ground reconnaissance to confirm. The second complication involved coordination with the French 2nd Armored Division. General Leclerc was a proud man who did not take orders well, especially from American colonels he considered his inferiors in combat experience. When Blackwood presented the operational plan, Leclerc immediately identified several problems, particularly regarding the timing of the ground advance and the inadequacy of the radio equipment being allocated for inter-unit communication. Leclerc's concerns were dismissed. Blackwood insisted that the timeline was non-negotiable and that the radio equipment, though acknowledged to be of marginal quality, would be sufficient for the operation's needs. The French general reluctantly agreed to participate. but he assigned some of his less experienced units to the mission, keeping his best troops in reserve. This decision would have tragic consequences. The friction between American and French commanders reflected deeper tensions in the Allied coalition. The Free French forces had fought bravely and suffered greatly during the war, but they operated under American and British command and supply. French officers resented what they saw as condescension from their Anglo-American allies. American officers sometimes viewed French concerns as excessive or motivated by wounded pride rather than legitimate operational considerations. In the specific case of Operation Confluence, Leclerc's concerns about radio equipment were entirely valid. The radios allocated for the operation were SCR 300 sets, which had a theoretical range of 3 miles, but in practice often managed less than a mile in mountainous terrain. For an operation spread across dozens of miles of difficult country, this was inadequate. Leclerc proposed requesting newer equipment or waiting until sufficient radios were available, but Blackwood insisted that delay was unacceptable. The third and perhaps most fatal complication came from the air support planning. The operation called for fighter bombers to suppress German anti-aircraft positions before the parachute drop and to provide close air support during the withdrawal. However, the air support request was filed with the wrong headquarters due to recent reorganization of command structures. As a result, 2 different air units were tasked with supporting the same operation, but neither was fully briefed on the ground plan, and neither knew the other had been assigned the same mission. This administrative error was compounded by the complex and rapidly evolving organization of Allied air power in the European theater. The 9th Air Force, which provided tactical air support to ground forces, had recently undergone reorganization. Responsibilities had shifted between different tactical air commands. New communication procedures were still being implemented. In this environment of organizational change, a request for air support could easily be misrouted or duplicated without anyone noticing the error. The pilots who would fly the mission were skilled and experienced, but they operated under constraints that limited their effectiveness. Fighter bomber pilots typically received mission briefings just hours before takeoff. These briefings focused on targets and threats, with less attention paid to the locations of friendly forces. The assumption was that friendly forces would be clearly marked, and that ground controllers would provide real-time information about the tactical situation. However, this system depended on reliable communication between air and ground, which Operation Confluence would not have. It also assumed that ground forces would be where the plan said they would be, an assumption that would prove catastrophically wrong. The pilots were set up to fail, though they did not know it yet. In the days leading up to the operation, the men who would carry it out prepared as best they could. The paratroopers of the 517th conducted equipment checks and reviewed their objectives. They had been told this was a moderate-risk operation, a characterization that would prove to be criminally optimistic. The French armor crews conducted maintenance on their tanks and studied maps of the approach routes. The infantry soldiers of the 45th Division, tasked with the diversionary attack, were simply told to raise hell along a 10-mile stretch of the front line to keep German attention fixed. The paratroopers had reason for confidence beyond their training and experience. They had jumped into combat before and survived. They trusted their leaders, their equipment, and each other. The esprit de corps of the 517th was exceptional even among elite units. These men had volunteered for hazardous duty and had proven themselves in battle. They approached Operation Confluence the way they approached every mission, with professional competence and determination to accomplish their objective. Among the paratroopers was Private First Class Michael Donovan, a 22-year-old from Boston who had joined the regiment after D-Day as a replacement. Donovan had participated in Operation Dragoon and had earned a reputation as a reliable soldier. He kept a journal against regulations, and his entries from the days before Operation Confluence reveal a mixture of anticipation and unease. He wrote about the incomplete briefings, the confusion about objectives, and the sense that the operation was more complicated than it needed to be. His final entry before the jump was prophetic. Something feels wrong about this one. Too many moving parts. Too many things that have to go right. On the evening of October 16th, the paratroopers loaded into their C-47 transport aircraft at an airfield near Nancy. The mood was tense but confident. These were veteran soldiers who had jumped into combat before and survived. They trusted their training and their equipment. What they did not know was that the weather forecast had changed significantly in the past 6 hours, with a major storm system moving into the region much faster than anticipated. The meteorological officer at the airfield had attempted to contact Colonel Blackwood to recommend postponing the drop, but Blackwood could not be reached. He was at a dinner with senior officers, celebrating his anticipated success. The weather issue exemplified a persistent problem throughout Operation Confluence. Information that should have triggered reconsideration of the plan was either ignored or never reached decision-makers. The meteorological officer's warning went to an aide who judged that the colonel should not be disturbed. The aide assumed that Blackwood would have made provisions for weather contingencies and that the transports could either fly around the storm or delay the drop by a few hours. Neither assumption was correct. The mission began to unravel before the first paratrooper exited his aircraft. The C-47 transports encountered the storm system approximately 20 miles from the drop zone. Visibility dropped to near zero, and severe turbulence threw the aircraft off course. The formation broke apart as pilots struggled to maintain control. Radio communication between aircraft became impossible due to static from the electrical storm. The Pathfinder team, whose job was to mark the drop zone with lights and radio beacons, had jumped first from the lead aircraft. They landed scattered across a 5-mile area, many of them in trees or on steep slopes. Only 3 of the 12 Pathfinders reached the designated drop zone, and their radio beacon was damaged during landing. They set up what lights they could, but in the storm and darkness, the pinpoints of light were virtually invisible to the pilots struggling to find the drop zone. As the main body of transports approached what they believed was the target area, most pilots made the decision to drop their paratroopers rather than return to base with a failed mission on their records. This decision was understandable given the circumstances, but it scattered the 517th across an area of more than 20 square miles. Men landed in forests, on mountainsides, in rivers, and in some cases, directly in German positions. Lieutenant Thomas McKenna landed in a tree on a steep slope and hung suspended in his harness for nearly 3 hours before he could cut himself down. When he finally reached the ground, he was alone, disoriented, and had no idea where he was relative to his objective. He began moving what he thought was west toward the rally point, but was actually heading north, deeper into German-held territory. McKenna's experience was replicated across the drop zone, or more accurately, across the multiple unintended drop zones where paratroopers found themselves. Standard doctrine called for scattered paratroopers to rally at predetermined points marked on their maps. However, the maps proved unreliable in the darkness and storm. Landmarks that should have been visible were obscured. Terrain features looked different on the ground than they appeared on maps. The compasses that paratroopers carried to navigate could not compensate for the complete disorientation caused by the scattered drop. Captain Robert Fitzgerald, the company commander for Baker Company, landed in the worst possible location, the middle of the logged forest area with its hidden stumps. His left leg snapped on impact with a stump, the bone breaking through the skin. Around him, he could hear the screams of other paratroopers who had suffered similar injuries. At least 30 men would be incapacitated by landing injuries alone, representing nearly 15% of the jumping force. Fitzgerald, despite his injury and excruciating pain, attempted to take command of the situation. He called out in the darkness, trying to gather whoever could hear him. Half a dozen paratroopers made their way to his voice. Several had injuries of their own. Together they attempted to provide first aid and assess their situation. They had landed miles from any objective, had no radio contact with anyone, and included several men who could not walk. Fitzgerald made the decision to hide and wait for dawn, hoping that daylight would allow them to determine their location and find a way back to friendly lines. Meanwhile, the German defenders were trying to make sense of the chaos. The scattered parachute drop had triggered alerts at multiple positions, and German commanders initially believed they were facing a major airborne assault across a broad front. Units were placed on high alert, reserves were mobilized, and all available forces were ordered to hunt down the scattered American paratroopers. The Sankt Wendel supply depot, far from being vulnerable, was now heavily reinforced and on maximum alert. The German response was competent and professional, reflecting the high quality of German military leadership even at this late stage of the war. Within 2 hours of the first parachute sightings, German forces had established a coordinated response. Patrols were dispatched to known landing areas, road junctions were reinforced, communication lines were checked and repaired where necessary. The Germans transformed what could have been a vulnerability into a trap for the scattered American forces. Among the German defenders was Hauptmann Ernst Weber, commander of a Volkssturm battalion near St. Wendel. Weber was a veteran of the Eastern Front who had been wounded and sent west to command what was essentially a home guard unit. His men were mostly older soldiers, teenagers, and men unfit for frontline service. They were poorly equipped and minimally trained. Weber did not expect them to face combat, certainly not against elite American paratroopers. When the alert came through about the parachute drop, Weber's first instinct was to pull his forces back and let regular army units handle the situation. However, his orders were clear: defend the roads and prevent any Allied forces from approaching St. Wendel. Weber deployed his men in defensive positions and waited, hoping that the scattered paratroopers would bypass his area. As dawn broke on October 17th, the situation was already catastrophic, but the worst was yet to come. The French 2nd Armored Division units began their advance toward the objective, following roads through the mountain valleys. They expected to rendezvous with the paratroopers and assault the supply depot in a coordinated attack. What they did not know was that the paratroopers were scattered, disorganized, and in no position to support any attack. The French armor moved forward in a column along a narrow mountain road. The lead vehicles were light tanks and armored cars, followed by medium tanks and infantry carriers. Standard doctrine called for reconnaissance ahead of the main force, but the schedule for Operation Confluence was tight, and the French commander felt pressure to maintain the timeline. The column moved faster than prudence would recommend in hostile territory. The French ran directly into a prepared German defensive position that the faulty intelligence had completely missed. The position consisted of two 75mm anti-tank guns concealed in tree line on high ground, overlooking the road, supported by machine gun positions and infantry. The Germans had constructed the position weeks earlier as part of the defensive network in the Vosges. Allied intelligence had either failed to detect it or had assessed it as abandoned. The lead tanks were destroyed by anti-tank guns in the first 5 minutes of combat. The following vehicles were trapped on the narrow road, unable to maneuver. German forces poured fire into the stalled column. Within an hour, the French had lost a third of their committed armor and were pinned down, unable to advance or withdraw. The French tank crews fought bravely, but they were at a severe disadvantage. The narrow road meant they could not deploy in any formation that would allow them to bring their numbers to bear. The Germans held the high ground and could fire down into the vulnerable top armor of the tanks. French infantry attempting to dismount and assault the German positions were cut down by machine gun fire. The situation rapidly became desperate. Lieutenant Pierre Dubois commanded a platoon of infantry riding in half-tracks near the middle of the column. When the shooting started, his half-track was behind a destroyed medium tank that blocked the road. Dubois ordered his men to dismount and take cover in the forest alongside the road. From there, they could see the disaster unfolding. Vehicles were burning, men were dying, and there seemed to be no way to break the German position or retreat from it. It was at this point that the air support arrived, and the disaster escalated into catastrophe. The first flight of American P-47 Thunderbolts appeared over the battlefield at approximately 0730 hours. The pilots had been briefed to attack German positions marked by colored smoke. However, they had not been informed that both American and French forces would be operating in the same area. When they spotted the stalled French column with smoke rising from the destroyed vehicles, they assumed they were looking at German armor that had been struck by the diversionary attack. The lead pilot radioed for confirmation of targets. His transmission was received by a ground controller who was coordinating the diversionary attack by the 45th Division 10 miles to the south. This controller, believing the pilot was asking about German positions in his sector, confirmed that there were enemy armor columns on the roads. The pilot, satisfied that he had confirmation, rolled in to attack. The P-47 struck the French column with rockets, bombs, and machine gun fire. The results were devastating. Fuel tanks exploded, ammunition cooked off, and men died without even seeing their attackers. French soldiers who escaped from burning vehicles were cut down by strafing runs. The concentrated firepower of multiple fighter bombers destroyed in minutes what the German defensive position had taken an hour to damage. Dubois watched in horror as American aircraft attacked his unit. He recognized the planes immediately. The distinctive shape of the P-47 was unmistakable. He understood that this was friendly fire, that somehow the pilots believed they were attacking Germans. He tried to use his radio to call for help, to contact someone who could stop the attack, but the radio had been damaged when his half-track took machine gun fire earlier in the engagement. Around Dubois, his men reacted with shock and confusion. Some tried to return fire at the aircraft, a futile gesture with their small arms. Others simply dove for cover and prayed. Several men were killed by strafing runs before the flight broke off to rearm and refuel. In the brief respite, Dubois assessed his situation. Perhaps half of his 40 men were dead or wounded. The vehicles were destroyed. The German position was still intact and still firing at anyone who showed themselves, and American aircraft would probably return. But the tragedy was not finished. A second flight of fighter bombers, the duplicate air support that had been requested due to the administrative error, arrived 15 minutes later. These pilots, seeing the smoke and destruction, assumed they had found the German supply depot that was their assigned target. They attacked what they believed were German forces attempting to defend the depot. In reality, they were attacking American paratroopers who had managed to group together and were attempting to move toward the sounds of combat, hoping to link up with friendly forces. Sergeant James Cooper had gathered 12 men from various units during the night. They had moved cautiously toward what they believed was the objective area, guided by the sound of distant gunfire. As dawn broke, they heard the roar of aircraft and then the explosions as the first flight of P-47s attacked the French column. Cooper did not know that the French were there, but he recognized the sound of American aircraft and assumed they were attacking German positions. Cooper's group was moving through a small clearing when the second flight appeared overhead. The pilot spotted movement and, believing he had found German troops attempting to reinforce their positions, initiated his attack run. Cooper looked up and saw the P-47 diving toward his position. For a frozen moment, he could not comprehend what was happening. Then understanding hit him simultaneously, with the realization that there was no time to escape. In the chaos and confusion of the morning of October 17th, small acts of courage and quick thinking by individual soldiers prevented the disaster from becoming even worse. Scattered groups of American paratroopers, realizing they were being attacked by their own aircraft, attempted to signal their identity using colored panels and smoke grenades. Some groups succeeded in halting the attacks. Others were not so fortunate. Cooper's reflexes saved his squad. Even as the P-47 dove toward them, he was screaming orders. He ordered his men to spread every piece of white cloth they had, undershirts, bandages, parachute panels, across the clearing in the pattern that was supposed to identify friendly forces. The men moved with desperate speed, knowing their lives depended on being visible from the air. The pattern was barely visible from the air, but one pilot spotted it just as he was lining up for a strafing run. The white panels formed a rough V shape, the signal for American forces. The pilot broke off his attack and radioed the other aircraft, warning them that they might be engaging friendly forces. The flight leader ordered all aircraft to climb to altitude and hold position while the situation was clarified. Cooper's quick thinking had saved his own squad and possibly several other groups of paratroopers in the vicinity. But he could do nothing about the disaster that had befallen the French column or the other paratroopers who had been caught by the first flight of P-47s. The fighters circled overhead while the pilots tried to establish communication with ground controllers who might clarify what was happening below them. On the ground with the destroyed French column, Lieutenant Pierre Dubois found himself in command of approximately 40 survivors, most of them wounded, pinned down by German fire, and with American fighters circling overhead. Dubois knew that if the aircraft attacked again, none of his men would survive. He also knew that he had no way to communicate with the pilots, as all the radios had been destroyed in the initial attack. Dubois made a desperate decision. He ordered his men to paint a large American flag on a piece of canvas torn from a truck cover, using blood, mud, and whatever else they could find to create something that might be recognizable from the air. It was a crude representation, but when they spread it across the hood of a destroyed vehicle, it was visible. One of the circling pilots spotted it, and though confused about why French forces would be displaying an American flag, held his fire until the situation could be clarified. The improvised flag saved the survivors of the French column from further air attack, but it could not save them from the German position that continued to fire on them. Dubois realized that they needed to either assault the German position or withdraw, and withdrawal seemed impossible with so many wounded. He gathered the handful of unwounded men and prepared to attempt an assault, knowing it was likely suicide, but seeing no alternative. Before Dubois could launch his attack, the situation changed dramatically. Hauptmann Weber, the German commander who had been watching the carnage unfold, made a decision that would later puzzle historians and become central to the cover-up that followed. Weber ordered his forces to cease fire and sent a soldier forward under a white flag. Weber's motivations were complex. He had watched the American aircraft attack what he knew were Allied forces. He had seen the desperate attempt to signal the aircraft with the improvised American flag. He recognized that the Allied forces were trapped and helpless, and that continuing to fire on them would be simple slaughter of men who were already beaten. Weber was a professional soldier, not a fanatic, and he saw no military purpose in killing men who were no longer capable of threatening his position. When the German soldier approached under the white flag, Dubois thought at first it was a trick, but the soldier called out in accented French that his commander wanted to discuss a ceasefire to allow both sides to collect their wounded. Dubois, seeing no alternative, agreed. For the next 2 hours, an informal truce held as French and German soldiers moved among the wreckage, treating wounded and recovering the dead. Weber and Dubois met briefly during the truce. The German officer explained that he had no interest in taking prisoners who would simply be a burden on his limited resources. He proposed that the French withdraw with their wounded, and in exchange, they would not report the location of his defensive position. Dubois agreed, understanding that Weber was offering him and his men a chance to survive when they had no right to expect it. Meanwhile, at various locations across the operational area, other small dramas were playing out. Groups of paratroopers were attempting to evade German patrols and make their way back to Allied lines. Some succeeded through skill and luck. Others were captured or killed. A few groups, disoriented and lost, wandered for days before finding friendly forces. Captain Fitzgerald, immobilized by his broken leg, was found by a German patrol. The German soldiers could have simply shot him, but instead they provided first aid and carried him to an aid station. Fitzgerald would later spend months as a prisoner of war, but he survived. He never forgot the fact that German soldiers had shown him mercy when they could easily have left him to die. Private First Class. Michael Donovan, the Boston paratrooper who had written about his premonitions before the jump, was among those who managed to evade capture. He linked up with 2 other paratroopers and spent 3 days moving through the forests, hiding during the day and traveling at night. They survived on emergency rations and water from streams. On the 4th day, they encountered an American patrol and were finally safe. These small victories, however, could not change the fundamental reality. Operation Confluence had failed completely. The paratroopers were scattered and disorganized, the French armor was destroyed, and German forces were converging on the area in strength. The diversionary attack had accomplished nothing except to draw attention to the region. The supply depot at St. Wendel remained untouched and unthreatened. Back at headquarters, Colonel Blackwood was receiving fragmentary reports that made it clear his carefully planned operation was collapsing. His response was to order the mission forward, insisting that the objectives could still be achieved if everyone did their duty. This order was countermanded by his immediate superior, who had the good sense to realize that the operation needed to be terminated immediately and all surviving forces withdrawn. The withdrawal was as chaotic as the operation itself. Scattered groups of paratroopers attempted to make their way back to friendly lines, often traveling at night, to avoid German patrols. Many groups encountered German positions and had to fight their way through. The survivors of the French column, escorted part of the way by Weber's men to ensure they did not stumble into other German units, made their way back on foot, carrying their wounded. It would take 3 days before all the survivors were accounted for. The final tally was devastating. Of the 212 paratroopers who had jumped into the operation, 47 were dead, 89 were wounded, and 12 were missing and presumed captured. The French 2nd Armored Division units had lost 34 dead, 58 wounded, and virtually all their committed vehicles. German casualties were minimal, less than a dozen killed and wounded. But the most disturbing statistic was this: more than 60% of Allied casualties had been caused by friendly fire. The numbers told a story of complete and utter failure. An operation that had been sold as a moderate-risk mission had resulted in casualty rates approaching 50%. The objectives had not been achieved. No damage had been inflicted on German capabilities. The only tangible result was that Allied forces had destroyed themselves through incompetence and poor planning. In the immediate aftermath of Operation Confluence, the Allied command faced a crisis. A military disaster of this magnitude normally would trigger formal investigations, courts-martial, and detailed after-action reports. Officers responsible for such catastrophic failures would face consequences. Families of the dead would be told what had happened and how their loved ones had died. The media would report on the incident. Lessons would be learned and disseminated to prevent future disasters. None of this happened. Instead, senior officers made a calculated decision to bury the entire incident. The official record would show that the casualties had occurred in routine combat operations, spread across several days and multiple locations. There would be no mention of Operation Confluence, no investigation, and no accountability. The decision to cover up the disaster was made at the highest levels of the Allied command. Generals who had approved the operation now faced the prospect of explaining how such a catastrophe had been allowed to occur. The friendly fire casualties were particularly embarrassing, suggesting fundamental failures in coordination and communication that reflected poorly on the command system as a whole. The fact that experienced elite forces had been effectively destroyed while accomplishing nothing was a propaganda gift to the Germans that the Allies desperately wanted to deny them. The cover-up required coordination at multiple levels of command. After-action reports were falsified or destroyed. Medical records were altered to misstate where and how men had been wounded. Death certificates listed false dates and locations. Witnesses were ordered to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of court-martial for revealing classified information. The conspiracy of silence was maintained through a combination of bureaucratic manipulation and direct intimidation. The soldiers who survived Operation Confluence were scattered across various units and hospitals. Those who were wounded were told that their injuries were classified because they had occurred during a secret mission. They were ordered not to discuss the operation with anyone, including doctors treating their wounds. Those who were uninjured were given similar orders and warned that violation would result in severe punishment. The threat of court-martial was real. Several soldiers who attempted to write home about the operation had their letters intercepted by censors. They were called in for stern interviews with intelligence officers who reminded them of their obligations under military law. One paratrooper, who wrote a detailed account of the operation in his personal diary, was forced to burn the diary while officers watched. The message was clear: Operation Confluence had never happened, and anyone who said otherwise would face consequences. But the Allied command faced an unexpected problem. The Germans knew what had happened. German intelligence had pieced together the broad outlines of the disaster from battlefield observations, prisoner interrogations, and intercepted radio communications. They knew about the scattered parachute drop, the destruction of the French column, and most importantly, they knew about the massive friendly fire incident. From a propaganda perspective, this was gold. The Germans could have made tremendous use of the story, broadcasting it worldwide to demonstrate Allied incompetence and to damage morale among American and French forces. Radio broadcasts could have featured testimony from captured paratroopers, confirming that they had been attacked by their own aircraft. Leaflets could have been distributed to Allied soldiers, asking them whether they trusted their own commanders and air support. Instead, the Germans did something remarkable. They remained silent. The full story of this decision would not emerge until decades later, but the essential facts are clear. German commanders in the region, facing their own catastrophic situation as the Reich crumbled around them, saw an opportunity for a different kind of victory. They approached the Allied command through neutral intermediaries, specifically Swiss Red Cross representatives, with a proposal: mutual silence about Operation Confluence in exchange for certain considerations regarding the treatment of prisoners and the conduct of operations in the region. The specific terms of this agreement have never been fully disclosed, but the outcome was clear. Both sides agreed to erase Operation Confluence from the historical record. The initial contact came through an unusual channel. A Swiss Red Cross official named Dr. Heinrich Müller, who was inspecting prisoner of war camps in the region, was approached by a German officer with a message for Allied commanders. The message was simple. The Germans had information about a recent disaster, but were willing to keep it quiet if certain conditions were met. Müller, understanding the sensitivity of what he was being told, agreed to carry the message. The Allied response was cautious but interested. A senior staff officer, operating with authorization from his commanders, met with German representatives at a neutral location in Switzerland. The negotiations were delicate. The Germans wanted assurances that certain officers would not be prosecuted for war crimes after the war ended. They wanted guarantees about the treatment of German prisoners. They wanted to ensure that certain towns and facilities would not be targeted for bombing. The Allied negotiators could not agree to all these demands, but they found areas of compromise. They agreed that the conduct of certain German officers in the Sankt Wendel area would be favorably noted in future war crimes proceedings. They agreed to improve conditions in certain prisoner of war camps. They agreed to avoid bombing specific civilian targets that the Germans identified. In exchange, the Germans agreed never to mention Operation Confluence in any propaganda or official communications. The German motivation was more complex than simple humanitarian concern. By late 1944, many German officers could see that the war was lost. They were beginning to think about the post-war period and their own accountability. An unwritten agreement with Allied commanders established a relationship that might prove valuable when the inevitable German surrender came. Additionally, some German officers had been genuinely appalled by what they had witnessed, seeing the friendly fire disaster as a tragedy that transcended the normal brutality of war. Hauptmann Weber, the officer who had declared the truce with the French forces, was central to the German decision. Weber had been profoundly affected by watching Allied forces destroy themselves. He had shown mercy to the French survivors and to the American paratroopers his men captured, treating them in accordance with the Geneva Conventions when he could easily have done otherwise. When approached by his superiors about the possibility of using the incident for propaganda, Weber argued against it. Weber's argument was both pragmatic and ethical. Pragmatically, he noted that using the incident for propaganda would unite Allied forces in anger and might provoke retaliation against German prisoners. Ethically, he believed that exploiting such a disaster was dishonorable. Weber wrote in a letter that was discovered after the war, "I saw good men die because of mistakes made by their commanders. This is tragedy, not propaganda material. If we use their deaths to score points, we become as morally compromised as we accuse our enemies of being." Weber's perspective was not universal among German officers, many of whom had no such scruples. However, his views were shared by enough senior officers that the decision was made to approach the Allies with an offer of mutual silence. The negotiations that followed established the framework for the cover-up that would last more than 3 decades. There was also a practical consideration. The German officers involved in the agreement knew that they had their own skeletons to hide. The Wehrmacht had committed numerous atrocities on the Eastern Front and elsewhere. If they cooperated in burying Operation Confluence, they might later expect Allied cooperation in overlooking some of their own less defensible actions. It was a cynical calculation, but understandable given the circumstances. The agreement held for more than 30 years. Not until the late 1970s did the story of Operation Confluence begin to emerge, and even then only in fragments. Historians researching other aspects of the war stumbled across references to the operation in documents that had escaped destruction. Veterans, finally released from their non-disclosure agreements or simply no longer caring about the consequences, began to share their stories. German records, captured at the end of the war but not fully examined until decades later, contained evidence of the operation and the subsequent agreement. The breakthrough came in 1978 when a researcher named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, working in the US National Archives, found a misfiled document that referenced Operation Confluence. The document was a logistics report that listed ammunition and supplies issued for an operation on October 17, 1944, but provided no details about what the operation was or what had happened. Mitchell, intrigued by the cryptic reference, began searching for more information. Mitchell's research led her to interview veterans of the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Most declined to speak with her or claimed not to remember anything about October 1944. But a few veterans, now elderly and feeling that the truth should finally be told, agreed to talk. Their accounts were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, but they painted a picture of a disaster that had been deliberately hidden. The full story did not become public knowledge until 1982, when a French historian named Claude Marchand published a detailed account based on interviews with survivors and examination of records in multiple national archives. Marchand had been researching the role of the French 2nd Armored Division in the liberation of France when he encountered references to a mysterious operation in October 1944 that had resulted in significant casualties but appeared in no official histories. Marchand's investigation was exhaustive. He tracked down survivors in 3 countries. He examined German archives that had recently been opened to researchers. He found the Swiss Red Cross official who had carried messages between the German and Allied commands. He even located the widow of Hauptmann Weber, who provided him with her husband's personal papers, including the letter explaining his opposition to using Operation Confluence for propaganda. When Marchand published his findings, the reaction was explosive. Veterans groups demanded explanations. Families of the dead, who had believed for nearly 4 decades that their loved ones had died in conventional combat operations, were outraged to learn the truth. Military historians debated the implications of the cover-up. Government officials on both sides of the Atlantic were forced to address uncomfortable questions about how such a conspiracy of silence had been maintained for so long. The ethical questions raised by Operation Confluence and its cover-up are profound and troubling. At the most basic level, the operation was an example of military incompetence that cost lives unnecessarily. Colonel Blackwood's lack of combat experience, his refusal to listen to legitimate concerns, and his prioritization of personal glory over the lives of his men represent leadership failures of the worst kind. The planning failures were systematic, intelligence was inadequate and sometimes simply wrong. Communication equipment was insufficient for the demands of the operation. Coordination between services and national forces was poor. The plan was overcomplicated and vulnerable to the kind of cascading failures that actually occurred. Any experienced combat officer reviewing the plan should have identified these problems, but the culture of the time discouraged junior officers from questioning their superiors, and senior officers were too invested in the operation to acknowledge its flaws. The friendly fire incident was partially a result of these planning failures, but it also reflected deeper problems in how air support was coordinated and controlled. The lack of effective communication between ground forces and aircraft was a known problem that had caused casualties in other operations, yet no systematic solution had been implemented. The duplicate tasking of air support was a bureaucratic error that should have been caught by someone in the chain of command, but the complexity and rapid pace of operations meant that such errors could slip through. The pilots who attacked friendly forces were following their training and their orders. Based on the information they had, they made reasonable decisions given what they knew, which was tragically incomplete. The system that put them in that situation was fundamentally flawed, but the individual pilots bore no responsibility for the disaster. Many of them were traumatized when they later learned that they had killed Allied soldiers. Yet, as egregious as these failures were, the cover-up was arguably worse. By hiding the truth about Operation Confluence, the Allied command prevented the military from learning lessons that might have prevented future disasters. The same planning mistakes, the same coordination failures, the same friendly fire risks remained unaddressed because officially they had never happened. How many lives might have been saved in subsequent operations if the lessons of Operation Confluence had been properly studied and disseminated? The families of the dead were lied to, denied the truth about how their sons and husbands had died. Some families spent years believing their loved ones had died in heroic combat operations, when in reality they had been killed by their own side through incompetence. When the truth finally emerged in the 1980s, many family members expressed feelings of betrayal that were in some ways more painful than the original grief of loss. The German decision to participate in the cover-up raises its own troubling questions. On one level, it can be seen as a gesture of military honor, a recognition that war is terrible enough without exploiting the enemy's mistakes for propaganda purposes. Weber's letter arguing against using the disaster for propaganda reflects a moral sensibility that transcends nationality and political ideology. On another level, however, the German silence was a cynical bargain struck by men who knew they had far worse crimes to hide and hoped that cooperation in covering up Allied failures might buy them lenience for their own actions. The negotiations that led to the agreement included discussions about war crimes, prosecutions, and treatment of prisoners, making it clear that self-interest was a significant motivation alongside any humanitarian concerns. The question of whether the agreement between Allied and German commanders was justified remains contentious among historians. Some argue that the agreement prevented the disaster from being exploited for propaganda purposes and may have saved lives by improving conditions for prisoners on both sides. Others argue that the truth should never have been suppressed regardless of the potential consequences, and that the cover-up represents a betrayal of the soldiers who died and their families who deserve to know what happened. The soldiers who survived Operation Confluence carried their secrets for decades. They could not speak openly about what had happened, could not share their experiences with family or friends, could not process their trauma in the way that veterans of other operations could. They lived with the knowledge that their comrades had died needlessly, that the military they served had covered up the truth, and that they were bound by orders to participate in that cover-up. The psychological burden of this enforced silence was immense. Veterans of Operation Confluence had higher rates of alcoholism, depression, and suicide than comparable groups of soldiers who had experienced similar levels of combat but were able to speak freely about their experiences. The inability to share their stories, to have their experiences acknowledged and validated, compounded the trauma of combat itself. Some survivors broke under the weight of this enforced silence. Thomas McKenna, the lieutenant who had spent hours hanging from a tree, developed severe alcoholism after the war and died in 1963 at the age of 41. His death certificate listed cirrhosis of the liver as the cause, but his family believed he had been slowly killing himself because of something that had happened during the war, something he could never bring himself to discuss. When the truth about Operation Confluence emerged years after his death, his daughter said, "Finally, we understood what had been haunting him, but by then it was too late to help him." James Cooper, the sergeant whose quick thinking had saved his squad from friendly fire, became a successful businessman after the war, but suffered from nightmares for the rest of his life. He would wake screaming, reliving the moment when he looked up and saw the P-47 diving toward his position. In the 1970s, when he was finally able to speak about Operation Confluence, he described the moral burden of remaining silent. "We had been told we were lying to protect national security, to avoid giving comfort to the enemy. But the war was over. Germany was divided and occupied. There was no enemy to protect against. We were lying to protect the reputations of officers who had gotten good men killed." Cooper attended reunions of the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment, where he would encounter other veterans of Operation Confluence. They would gather in small groups, speaking in low voices about the operation they were not supposed to discuss. There was comfort in sharing their experiences with men who understood, but also frustration that they could not speak openly. Several veterans reported that they felt like they were living a lie, honored for their service, while forbidden to acknowledge the full truth of what they had experienced. Pierre Dubois, the French lieutenant who had led the survivors of the destroyed armor column, never spoke publicly about Operation Confluence, even after the story became public. He died in 1995, and his family found among his papers a detailed written account of the operation, clearly written as a form of testimony, but never shared. In it he wrote, "The worst part was not the attack, not watching my men die, not even knowing that it was our own allies who had killed them. The worst part was being ordered to lie about it, to pretend it never happened, to let the men responsible escape any consequences. That was when I understood that honor in war is often the first casualty." Dubois' account included details about his encounter with Hauptmann Weber and the informal truce that had allowed the French survivors to withdraw. He expressed respect for Weber's conduct, noting that the German officer had shown more humanity in the midst of battle than many Allied commanders had shown in the aftermath. This perspective was controversial when his account was finally published, but it reflected the complex reality of warfare, where enemies sometimes show honor while allies can betray. Michael Donovan, the Boston paratrooper who had written about his premonitions before the jump, survived the war and returned home. He kept a second journal after the war, documenting his struggles to readjust to civilian life while carrying the secret of Operation Confluence. His entries reveal a man torn between loyalty to his military oaths and a sense that the truth should be told. In 1980, near the end of his life, he wrote, "I have kept this secret for 36 years. I am tired of lying. The men who died deserve better than to be forgotten in a classified file. Their families deserve the truth. I pray that someone will have the courage to tell the story that we have been forbidden to tell." Colonel Harrison Blackwood was quietly reassigned to a training command after Operation Confluence. He never received the combat command and glory he had sought. His efficiency reports from the period mention judgment issues and suggest that his superiors recognized his culpability, even if they were unwilling to formally acknowledge it. After the war, he worked in defense contracting and lived comfortably until his death in 1978. He never spoke publicly about the operation and left no personal papers that addressed it. When the story began to emerge in the late 1970s, journalists attempted to interview Blackwood, but he refused all requests. According to his family, he became agitated and angry when the subject was raised. He died having never acknowledged his role in the disaster, never apologized to the families of the dead, never accepted responsibility for the decisions that had cost so many lives. His obituary described him as a decorated World War II veteran, with no mention of Operation Confluence. The German officers who participated in the agreement to cover up Operation Confluence had mixed fates. Some were tried for war crimes related to their actions on the Eastern Front and served prison sentences. Others successfully transitioned to civilian life in post-war Germany and never faced legal consequences for their wartime conduct. The agreement to suppress information about Operation Confluence may have provided some of them with a degree of protection from prosecution, though the full extent of this is unclear from available records. Hauptmann Ernst Weber, the officer who had declared the truce with the French forces and argued against using the disaster for propaganda, survived the war and became a teacher in West Germany. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, but was known to be active in veterans organizations that promoted reconciliation between former enemies. In a 1986 interview, shortly before his death, he expressed regret about the cover-up. "We thought we were being honorable by agreeing to silence. We thought we were respecting the dignity of the dead, but really we were just helping powerful men escape the consequences of their mistakes. The families deserved better." Weber's widow provided researchers with access to his personal papers, which included correspondence with some of the Allied officers involved in negotiating the agreement. These letters reveal that Weber maintained contact with several of these officers after the war, suggesting that the relationship established through the cover-up did indeed have lasting effects. Whether this represented genuine friendship, mutual self-interest, or some combination of both remains a matter of interpretation. The broader question of what Operation Confluence reveals about military culture and accountability remains relevant decades after the events. The operation was not unique in being a disaster. Military history is full of catastrophic failures, nor was it unique in involving friendly fire casualties. Such incidents have occurred in every modern war. What made Operation Confluence unusual was the systematic effort by both sides to erase it from history. This erasure was possible because of the institutional power of military hierarchies and the culture of secrecy that surrounds military operations. Officers who would never consider lying in their personal lives participated in an elaborate institutional lie because they were ordered to do so and because they believed the alternative, public accountability for the disaster, would damage the military as an institution. They prioritized institutional loyalty over truthfulness and over the rights of the families of the dead. The cover-up was also possible because of the nature of war itself. In the chaos of combat, deaths can be easily misattributed. Records can be lost or destroyed without arousing suspicion. Soldiers die in so many different ways that a pattern of unusual casualties might not be noticed unless someone is specifically looking for it. The very confusion that contributed to the disaster also made it possible to hide the disaster. The classification system that militaries used to protect sensitive information provided convenient cover for the cover-up. Documents related to Operation Confluence could be classified on legitimate grounds. They contained information about operational planning, equipment capabilities, and tactical procedures that might be valuable to enemies. But the classification also conveniently prevented public scrutiny of the disaster and protected those responsible from accountability. The system designed to protect military effectiveness was perverted to protect military reputations. When the story of Operation Confluence finally became public in the 1980s, it prompted some soul-searching within military institutions, but the lessons learned were limited. Official reports acknowledged that the cover-up had been wrong and that families had deserved to know the truth. Some reforms were implemented regarding how friendly fire incidents were investigated and reported, but there was no systematic effort to identify and acknowledge other operations that might have been similarly buried. The institutional culture that had enabled the cover-up remained largely intact. Military leaders expressed regret about Operation Confluence, but also argued that the pressures of wartime had made the cover-up understandable, if not justifiable. They noted that commanders in 1944 were fighting an existential war against Nazi Germany and could not afford the luxury of public introspection about every mistake. They suggested that applying peacetime ethical standards to wartime decisions was unfair and ahistorical. These arguments have some merit, but are ultimately insufficient. The decision to cover up Operation Confluence was not made in the heat of battle, but in the relative calm of headquarters far from the front lines. The officers involved had time to consider their choices and the implications of those choices. They chose institutional self-protection over honesty, and they maintained that choice for decades after the war had ended, and the original justifications for secrecy had evaporated. For historians, Operation Confluence serves as a reminder of how much of the past remains hidden, especially when it comes to military history. Official records are often incomplete, sometimes deliberately so. The stories that make it into history books are the ones that people in power wanted remembered. The stories that embarrass or incriminate tend to disappear unless someone makes the effort to dig them out. The recovery of the Operation Confluence story required decades of work by multiple researchers, cooperation from veterans willing to break their silence, and access to archives that had previously been closed or inadequately examined. Even now, significant gaps remain in the historical record. Many documents were destroyed. Many participants died without telling their stories. Many details of the agreement between Allied and German commanders remain classified or lost. This raises troubling questions about how many other similar incidents remain hidden. If Operation Confluence, with its massive casualty count and involvement of multiple military units, could be successfully suppressed for 38 years, what other disasters might have been buried completely? How much of military history as we know it consists of carefully curated success stories, while the failures and scandals have been quietly erased? The families who learned the truth in the 1980s, 38 years after their loved ones died, were asked by reporters how they felt about the cover-up. The responses ranged from anger to resignation to a kind of bitter vindication that their suspicions had been confirmed. Margaret Richardson, whose husband Robert had been a paratrooper in the 517th, said something that captured the essential tragedy. "They told me he died a hero. They gave me a flag and a medal and told me he had given his life for his country. For 38 years I was proud of how he died. Then I learned he had been killed by our own planes because someone made mistakes and no one wanted to admit it. They took away not just my husband, but my right to know the truth about how he died. That's a theft that can never be made right." Other family members expressed similar sentiments. Some said they had always suspected that the official story was incomplete or inaccurate. They had noticed inconsistencies in what they were told, or their loved ones had hinted at things they could not fully explain before being silenced. When the truth finally emerged, these families felt vindicated, but also angry that they had not been trusted with the truth decades earlier. A few family members defended the cover-up, arguing that it had been necessary to protect military effectiveness during the war and that revealing the truth would have served no purpose except to cause pain. These families preferred to remember their loved ones as having died heroically rather than as victims of bureaucratic incompetence and friendly fire. The publication of the truth reopened old wounds without, in their view, providing any compensating benefit. The veterans who had maintained the secret for decades had mixed feelings when the truth finally came out. Some felt relief that they could finally speak openly about their experiences. Others felt violated that their stories were being told without their control over the narrative. A few expressed anger at the researchers and journalists who had exposed the cover-up, arguing that some secrets should remain buried. The debate about whether the truth should have been revealed continues among historians and ethicists. Those who argue for disclosure point to the rights of families to know the truth, the importance of historical accuracy, and the need for accountability to prevent future disasters. Those who argue for continued secrecy emphasize the potential damage to military morale and effectiveness, the pain caused to families by revealing unpleasant truths, and the practical impossibility of achieving complete transparency about military operations. Operation Confluence remains a footnote in military history, a small incident in a massive war that killed millions, but it stands as a powerful example of how military culture can fail soldiers and their families, and how the conspiracy of silence between enemies can sometimes be more damaging than the combat itself. The mission that went so wrong both sides swore to keep it secret ultimately teaches us that some truths, no matter how painful, must be told, and that accountability, no matter how embarrassing, must be enforced if military institutions are to maintain their legitimacy and honor. The men who died in Operation Confluence are remembered now, their story finally told. The cover-up that tried to erase them from history has itself been exposed. But the larger questions the operation raises, about military accountability, about institutional honesty, about the rights of families to know the truth, remain as relevant today as they were in 1944. In that sense, Operation Confluence is not just a historical curiosity. It is a cautionary tale for every generation that sends soldiers into harm's way and must then account for how they lived and died. Modern military operations continue to involve complex coordination, advanced technology, and the ever-present risk of friendly fire. The systems and procedures designed to prevent disasters like Operation Confluence are more sophisticated than they were in 1944, but they are not foolproof. Friendly fire incidents still occur in modern conflicts, though usually on a smaller scale and with better documentation and accountability than was the case with Operation Confluence. The story of Operation Confluence reminds us that behind every military operation are individual human beings, soldiers who trust their leaders, families who wait for their return, and officers who must balance competing demands and make decisions under pressure. When those systems fail, when that trust is betrayed, when those decisions prove catastrophic, there must be accountability. The alternative is to perpetuate a culture where mistakes are hidden rather than learned from, where institutional self-protection takes precedence over honesty, and where the people who pay the price are those who can least afford it. The final lesson of Operation Confluence is perhaps the simplest and most important. The truth matters. It matters to the families who deserve to know how their loved ones died. It matters to historians who seek to understand the past accurately. It matters to military institutions that depend on public trust and support. And it matters to future soldiers who deserve to learn from the mistakes of the past rather than repeat them because those mistakes were hidden. The men who died on October 17, 1944, in the forests and valleys of the Vosges Mountains, died because of failures in planning, coordination, and leadership. They died because officers prioritized career advancement over the lives of their men. They died because systems designed to protect them failed catastrophically. These truths were suppressed for nearly 4 decades, but they could not be suppressed forever. In the end, the story of Operation Confluence survived precisely because some truths are too important to remain buried, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against them.